Welcome to the Gloria Ferrer Masterclass. We have a fun lineup for you tonight. I am Kyle Altomare, the winemaker here at Gloria Ferrer. To my right is Brad Kurtz, our vineyard director, and we are going to be talking to you guys today about different vintages of growing and making sparkling wine. We've got a couple of library wines we're going to open up here, talk about tonight, but we're going to talk about cool vintages, warm vintages, kind of the last decade of what's been going on here in Carneros at Gloria Ferrer, and let's jump into it, Brad.
All right, what do you got right there?
I have some 2015 extended tirage Blanc de Blancs. What are you pouring?
I got the 2010.
2010. All right, so we're going back.
This one's just been disgorged. I believe both of these. Just disgorged. So they've been sitting for quite a while in tirage, and they are ready to go.
Oh yeah, these are fun wines to work on. So as we're getting these in the glass, I wanted to talk to you because we're starting to get into what you and I are considering the start of vintage 2025.
Yes.
Right. So 2024 is behind us. We've got wines pre-blended and just resting until the first of the year when we start actually blending wines to get laid down for tirage. And right now, pruning is the focus, right? We're pre-pruning in some blocks and getting ready to talk about our pruning strategy for 2025. And in a vintage where you have no idea what the weather is going to be,
here, I'll trade you.
We have no idea what's going on yet. How do you make these decisions when we're talking about how to prune vineyards for growing sparkling wine?
Yeah, so it's fun because we are, like you said, at the beginning of vintage 2025. Myself and our vineyard team are just starting to kind of look at the vines. The leaves have all sort of fallen off as they do about this time of the year. It starts to get cold, the leaves senesce, and we get to see what the skeleton of the vine looks like. So essentially, this is the time where I start going out. Before the crew starts pruning, I start going out. I start going from block to block. I might prune, 10 to 15 vines in a bunch of different blocks, just to get my eyes on what the shape of these vines are, what the strength of the canes are, how the vines look, how I want to plan for the next vintage.
Sure.
And how I want to go through and strategize with our pruning so I can pass that information along to our team and make sure that the pruning gets done properly. So, in this point in the year, we have no idea what kind of curveballs 2025. It's a beautiful time,
Yeah.
Everything's
perfect right now.
The 2025 vintage is perfect so far. So, we have, nothing to worry about, but, you have to prepare for everything, right? So that's the thing. It's, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yep.
So going out there and trying to make your vineyard as resilient as possible to as many different curveballs as possible. Starting right now, we finished putting compost out. Compost being something that really helps build the health of our soils. We put our cover crop out. Our cover crop's starting to grow, something that really can help with the diversity of the insect populations in our vineyards, can help with soil health, things like that. All of these things are things that make our vineyards more resilient. Mm-hmm. They have to do with our organic farming principles as well, but it is really about making our vineyards resilient. You kind of have two big threats, right? You have temperature-related threats,
okay,
and you have precipitation-related threats. And then everything else is a spin-off of that, including, disease, insects. Most of those are generally related to weather as well. So when you have, conditions that are conducive to powdery mildew, that's usually driven by the weather in the season. So we have to look at, we have a vast array of vintages. You have everything from, like we were just reminiscing about the 2022 vintage and the 2023 vintage. So 2022 here in Carneros was dry, it was
arid,
hot, we had crazy heat waves, it was low yields, it was a difficult vintage for one reason. Then in 2023 we had almost the polar opposite vintage, which was we had a super late bud break. It was cold. It was wet. It was rainy. We got rain in June.
You couldn't paint two different vintages.
Yeah, we had tons of disease pressure because there was so much moisture out there, and our sulfur applications weren't working because it was so cold out, and they kept getting washed off the vine every time it rained. So we had two vintages of, dramatically different. I think our harvest date was almost a month apart in those vintages. So, we have to be prepared, and we're starting now with pruning, but this is going to go through the entire vintage. We have to prepare for the worst. In both scenarios, usually it's not just too hot, it can also be too cold. It's not just too dry, it can also be too wet. And we have to prepare for any situation and scenario that could come at us in the next vintage.
Definitely. So we're talking a lot about timelines, and right now we're at the start of vintage 2025. You've applied compost, we're pre-pruning in some blocks, we're going out and looking at vine architecture, setting up the ideal canopy and the ideal fruit zone for the next vintage, right? So if you were farming in a vacuum, give me an idea of what it looks like from a vintage start to finish for an ideal timeline. When would you prune? When do we apply nutrients? When do we get bud break? What does that look like?
Yeah. So in an ideal year, if I'm pruning one vine and timing and logistics are not of concern and I want it, and it's just a model year.
Yep.
2024 was kind of one of those years. It was, in a lot of cases, it was a very a paradigm year where it was like, this is, exactly what you would expect in Carneros.
Yeah.
And so you have your pruning, you go through and you're starting pruning. Ideally, your pruning gets done around February. February is usually, you want to do it right before bud break. In frost sensitive areas, you want to delay that a little bit because it will actually delay the vines waking up. So the later you prune, generally the later the buds will push and the vines will start to grow, which can, buy you an extra week to 10 days of frost protection and keep the vines frost hardy for an extra, 10 to 14 days, which
it doesn't
can
sound
make or break a vintage.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but that in terms of wine growing is millennia, right? It is two different timelines.
So usually February is my goal for pruning. Now in the real world, I have to typically start pruning in January. We've got 300 plus acres to cover, and I've got a team of about 20 people that gets that done. So it's go, go, go. We got to cover a lot of ground. And if it's raining a lot, you miss some days because of the rain, then you got to make up those days and you got to get that pruning done. The vines don't wait for you. The weather doesn't wait for you.
Mother Nature waits for no man.
You have to keep going no matter what Mother Nature throws at you. So when we finish pruning, hopefully we're done by mid-March. That's about the time of bud break. It's also the time we pull the sheep out of the vineyards. So the sheep go into the vineyards around February as we're pruning. They mow down the cover crop. They get pulled out right before bud break so they don't eat the vines. Tender grape leaves are a nice treat for sheep. So we want to make sure we get them out of there on time before bud break.
Don't eat the vintage, right?
Yep. And so bud break typically happens end-ish of March, depending on the vintage. It can happen middle of March. It could happen in early April. But it's all dependent on the vintage. It's also dependent on varietal. Pinot versus Chardonnay versus Pinot Blanc. Certain other varietals don't push bud until mid-April. Some even later. So it depends on the varietal. It depends on the vintage, the site. The cooler sites push bud break later. The warmer sites up in the hills where the nights aren't, the cold air doesn't sit on them at night, the bud breaks a little bit earlier. So it's kind of depends on a lot of things.
There's a number of factors.
There's
no
factors.
There's no hard and fast rule.
So the buds start growing. There you get your little baby shoots on the vines. They start growing. Then they hit about 4 to 6 inches in length. That triggers us that we need to get out there and start shoot thinning. So shoot thinning is the process. You leave your perfect spurs and your perfect canes, and you want all those buds to push and the vines to grow from there. But vines sometimes can be vigorous growers, and they will push shoots from the trunks. They'll push shoots from the base of the spurs, and they'll really clog up the vine and waste energy on these what we call suckers. Some people call them water shoots. But suckers is generally the name. They're sucking energy from the shoots that you want to grow. The vine's putting resources, water, nutrients, carbohydrates into those shoots when you want it to go into the shoots that you've strategically left. So the crew will go through and basically clean those off. They just basically snap them at the base. And then all the energy that would have gone into those goes to the shoots and the fruit that you left.
Because it's green growth at this point, so it's
It's
not
very
lignified
tender
wood.
green
It's
growth.
easy to just go by and almost just rub it right off.
You can rub it right off, and it'll break cleanly off, and it typically won't grow back unless you have crazy weird conditions. But typically we can get that done in one pass. So shoots will continue to grow, and once you remove the suckers, it kind of jump starts them.
It, right?
And the weather's typically warming up. This is usually, we're looking at like end of April, early May. Weather's warming up. Those vines start growing. They love the heat. They love the warmth. You know, once it gets above, 75 degrees, they really start to take off. And so, you go, they grow, 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 grow. You start to see the clusters on the shoots. Typically, one shoot has 2 clusters on it, especially for Pinot Noir. And those shoots don't have grapes on them yet. They have what are called inflorescence. They're the flowers, the bunches of flowers. And then usually around mid-May is when bloom happens. So they're just these tightly closed little flowers, and then the caps will fall off the flowers, and you'll actually see a little white flower with some pollen. That happens usually mid-May.
Yep.
Grapevines are self-pollinating. The pollination actually happens while the cap is still on the flower, not when it's open. It doesn't require pollinators to pollinate it. But you can still have adverse effects during that time. It's a critical time.
Yeah.
Things like high winds, hail, frosts. This is a really sensitive time in the vine's life cycle. Warm weather and too much growth, and it won't pollinate properly. Cold weather, and it extends the bloom, and it opens you up to more risk because your bloom period is longer. Yeah, disease can affect the blooms. You can get things like botrytis and powdery mildew even on the blooms. So it's a critical time, and around mid-May is when we're really out there keeping an eye on the vineyard, making sure everything's looking good. Typically, we're going out there and we're starting to lift wires too at this time. So the shoots are just sitting freely on the vine right now. They don't have any supports. We're in a windy area, like we've talked about. Wind is our terroir here. That's our critical factor that really defines our wines and our estate is the wind. And when we get some big windstorms in May, I can lose a lot of sleep over that, because you'll come in the morning and you'll see shoots, like we just talked about how easy they are to break off. They'll snap right off. So you really want to be careful and get those wires up, secure those shoots in place, give them some support, so when that wind does blow, they might flop around a little bit, but they're not going to break off.
They have structure there that holds them in place.
Yep, so the wires start below the vine, the crew comes up, they pull them up, and they hook them onto the cross arms, and that basically folds the shoots up and holds them in tight, and we call it vertical shoot positioning. That's the name of our trellis system, and it works really well here in Carneros, where the winds can get quite strong. After that, the vines continue to grow, 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 until you hit about late June, early July, depending on the vintage, and then the vegetative growth stops, it caps out. Some years where it's a lot of rain and warm and the vines are really happy, we have to come through and hedge them to make sure they don't keep growing. We want them to, at some point, start focusing on ripening the fruit. So after flowering, those baby berries start to grow, 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 grow.
Yep.
And then we hit July. July is kind of the end of that growth period. The fruit starts going from these green hard berries to, in Pinot Noir's case, red, purple, soft, sweeter berries. If you bite into one of those green berries, it is gonna burn your mouth. It's like so much acid, it'll burn your mouth. It will not taste good. But then once July hits and the process we call veraison happens, the berries will start to soften, they'll start to sweeten up, they'll start to get their characteristic flavors. For Chardonnay, it'll go from green to more of like a translucent yellow.
Skins will get softer.
They'll get softer. Like I said, they'll start to sweeten up and they'll start to flavor up.
Yep.
At that point in time, the canopy has stopped growing, and the vine's taking all of its energy that it's creating through photosynthesis and putting all that energy not into making more vine, but into ripening the fruit. And that's what we want to see. That's a critical time.
Yes.
We don't want to see stress in the vines at that point in the time. There's a lot of really important metabolic reactions that are going on within the grape and within the vine, a lot of hormonal triggers that are going on with the vine. And when it's stressed, it can do one thing. When it's happy and stress-free, it can cause another reaction. So we're looking for things like preserving the acidity in the grapes. We're looking for things like reducing tannin.
Yep.
We're looking for things like increasing aromatics in the grapes. So all of that is how we treat the vines really helps to create these triggers within the vine. When we talk about stress levels, when we talk about nutrient capacity, when we talk about water capacity, we need to talk about all those things to help get to the quality goals that we have for the grapes.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing that you point out with the aromatic component of this, because so much of this is driven by sight. So much of this is driven by things that are very true to a sense of place. But aromatics are one thing that if you have stress factors in vines and you don't get those aromatic precursors, on our side, on the winemaking side, everything is about those precursors, right?
Yes.
If the precursor isn't there, you're never going to get the aromatic intensity. You're never going to get the aromatic profile that you're looking for.
Yeah.
So like you said, if we don't hit that correct nutrient profile, if we don't make sure that that vine, especially for sparkling, which we don't want to be
and
stressed.
even the fermentations,
Yeah.
we see those stressed,
Yes.
it's not like this never happens to us.
Sure.
It does. And you have certain vineyards and certain vintages.
Maybe the health of the vineyard isn't as repeat, or maybe
exactly. And that's stuff that virus can affect.
Yep.
Things like that. And you see it in the fermenter. You smell the wines in it. They smell off. They don't taste right.
Yep.
And a lot of that can be driven just by the health and nutrient, the fertility capacity of the vines.
Yep.
So,
And essentially what you're doing on the vineyard side is giving us the building blocks to start getting these fermentations off on the right foot, right?
Yep.
If we have those deficiencies in the vineyard, there's no way that we're going to make up for them in the winery. So
and that's where the teamwork from the winemaking team and the vineyard team really is important, because if the communication feedback isn't there, then those problems won't get solved for the next vintage.
Yep, it's exactly why you taste your fermenters every day with us, right?
Exactly.
It's like, hey, we're seeing these problems. Let's go figure out what's going on in these blocks, right? So, okay, so we've gone
Going
through
back to July.
Yep.
So July, even into June, are also critical times for another reason. We talked about precipitation. We talked about temperature. Heat waves have been a big problem in California wine growing for the last, I'm sure forever, but they've been increasingly a problem in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years.
Sure.
When we talk about heat waves, we're talking about Carneros, generally a very cool region, hitting 105, 106, 107 degrees, which Pinot Noir is not set up for those kinds of temperatures.
Does not like it.
In Burgundy, I wouldn't say it typically gets to 105 degrees.
Maybe once in the recorded history. You have to go back and check the record, but it's not very often.
It's not very often, and the Pinot Noir vine is not well adapted to that.
Yes.
Chardonnay handles it slightly better, but Pinot Noir and even the Pinot Blanc really don't fare well in those conditions. So I told you before, we talked about it before, but it's all about building resiliency in, right? How do we set ourselves up for success? This doesn't happen every vintage. 2023, we had like 2 days over 100 degrees. It was a very cool vintage, very easy for that. Difficult for other reasons, but it was very easy for the heat waves. But that's a time where, for us as sparkling winemakers, heat waves are enemy number one.
Catastrophic.
It can be catastrophic to a vintage. It's something that we've seen in the past. Luckily, we come off the vine early. We can, move into the harvest type part of the discussion. But, after those grapes turn, it's a slow process for them to go through variation. It's usually about 20 days from when you see the first red berries in a vineyard till the variation process being complete and all the berries are red. It doesn't happen where the whole bunch... you leave work one day and you come in the next day and all the bunches are all red all of a
It's
sudden.
not that quick.
Yeah, it's a slow process.
Yep.
Depending on the vintage, some vintages it can be 12 days, some it can be 25 days long.
Yeah.
But for sparkling wine, essentially when that last berry goes from green
to red,
or that last berry goes from hard to soft,
Yep.
that's when it's time to pick.
I mean, you and I are always talking right about 50% variation. That's kind of our kicker, right? Because that's when our vineyard drives change from weekly to daily.
Yes.
We're out there every day. We're looking at, okay, historically, what do we need to look at? Where are we getting samples? We're setting our sampling schedule. We're going through and saying, we need to be ready because we've got a 2-week
And we've seen
window.
stuff sneak up on us.
That happened in 2024,
Yeah,
right? We were
last
out
year.
there and we had harvest bets calling it, and we were off by a week. And we were just putzing around in one of the blocks out there and said, wow, this tastes really, really good. Maybe we should sample it. Sure enough, we picked the next day because it
We
was
sampled
perfect.
it. We didn't believe the sample. We sent them back out to
Sample it again, right?
And
Had to be the intern's fault, right?
It's the intern's fault, not our fault. But sample it a second time. Oh, still looks like it's ready. We're picking tomorrow.
We're picking it. It was also good because it's what we call like the grease the wheels pick.
Yes.
Your crew gets a chance
It was like a
to
5-ton pick.
Yeah. Your crew gets a chance to get the dust off the tractors, get everything rolling. It's a small block. We can pick it in early light. We don't have to do it in midnight, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
So it was a fun training wheel exercise and
Definitely.
a reminder that we don't know everything.
Correct.
But yeah, so veraison is kind of that important time because it's the last step where you can really I like to say that we don't make the wines. We just try not to ruin the wines.
Sure.
You don't want to force a vineyard or a wine to be something it's not. You just try and prevent it from going bad or going poorly. So when you have adverse climatic conditions, you have adverse disease pressure, your goal is to protect that vine and guide it to the finish line.
Sure.
Right? So my goal is to guide it to harvest and make sure nothing bad happens between pruning and harvest, and then guide it into the winery where you take over and guide it to its final state where it's, 24 years later, it's in our glass.
Yep.
And so, just in the case of this wine.
If we've both done our job, then that happens, right?
And then it tastes like this, and it's great.
So, we have two very different vintages in the glass, and I think when you taste these wines, you'll start to see one of these wines, markedly cool vintage. One of them, a little bit more of a what I would call a warmer year. It wasn't hot, but it was warmer. Let's talk about what do you do and what are the farming differences if you have a cool vintage. And we know pretty early on, right, how things are going to shape up in certain quarters, right? Like you can kind of see what spring's doing. You can kind of see what summer's doing.
Yeah, we can look at some long-term forecasts.
Exactly.
Are somewhat accurate that give us an idea
and at least
of what
make a
it's going to
plan
be
or a game plan, right?
Yes.
So talk to me about what happens in a vintage that is cool, like 2023, remarkably cool. Harvested one of the latest harvest starts that we've ever had here.
We didn't start picking until the
29th.
very end of August.
Barely. I was worried that we weren't going to get into picking
it was a
in
lot
August.
of us sitting around twiddling our thumbs and just waiting for harvest to start.
That was one that was like, I guess we can sample it again. I guess we can sample it again.
And the crews are sitting around, chomping at the bit, ready to pick. Yeah. And we're saying, sorry, nothing's ready yet.
Yep.
And there's a lot of frustration there on all sides.
Yep. But talk to me about farming in something like 2023 versus 2022, which was very hot, had much less rainfall than 2023. Adverse heat events, what we call adverse heat events, which means days over 100 or huge swings, right? So what are some tools that you have in a cool vintage versus a warm vintage to make sure that we get these things across the finish line?
Yeah, my biggest concern in a cool vintage, Pinot Noir is not an overly vigorous grape varietal. Chardonnay is slightly more vigorous, but Pinot Noir is not an overly vigorous grape varietal. It's well accustomed to lots of water where it's from in Burgundy and in Champagne, very wet regions. So it's not a vine that becomes out of balance when it gets lots of rainfall. And when we say lots of rainfall, our lots of rainfall is not like northern France.
Yeah.
Lots of rainfall. So the vines can handle that amount of water. So, we got, I think, 32 inches of rain in 2023, which is a good rainfall year for us.
Average.
It's 50% or more above average. But for these Pinot Noir vines, they can handle that. The struggle is getting into the vineyard and getting the jobs done on time. When it's a muddy mess out there, you got to get the sheep out. You got to make sure you're moving the sheep constantly. You don't want to graze as aggressively in a wet year because you'll just create a muddy mess and an erosion risk. You'll cause compaction on the soils. So you want to leave a little extra grass. You want to get the sheep out of there a little earlier. Versus a dry year, you pretty much graze it to the dirt because you don't want that cover crop soaking up all that water. Soaking up all that water and transpiring that water back out in the atmosphere, and then you lose it for the vines before they even wake up from bud break. So we'll leave a little extra cover crop in a wet year versus a dry year. I might not disc or mow until, once the sheep come through, there's plenty of time for the grass and the cover crop to regrow. We might not come in to mow until, a month after that, a month after bud break. Let that grass grow, draw some of the water out, so we can get the tractors in there. We can send the crews in there. Pruning is always an issue in a cold, wet year because there's so many rain days. It's dangerous and it's not fun for anybody to be out there pruning in the rain. It's also not good for the health of the vine. It can open them up. If you're opening wounds on the vine while it's actively raining, you can open yourself up to a lot of trunk disease issues. So generally speaking, getting jobs done on time in a wet year, especially in the early part of the year, is really tricky. I might not disc at all, or might very minimally disc, which is like turning over the soil to keep the water in. And that's, just a mark of that vintage to try and, mitigate all the water. Early in the season, that water can be a real problem. And, it can be a mud. You can get tractors stuck. You can cause compaction by putting tractors in there too early.
Especially in the clay soils that we have.
Especially in the clay soils. And it's also important to get the tractors out there because you do need to spray. When there's a lot of moisture out there, that's when we're at the highest risk for things like powdery mildew, things like botrytis. Those are big issues in wet years versus dry years. It's hardly even a thought, right? You put out your preventative applications, but you're putting out typically about half the amount of passes versus in a wet year. So the tractor might go through that vineyard, 5 times, 6 times in a dry year versus a wet year might be out there 10 to 12 times. So it's important in a wet year to be able to get the tractors out, dry the top 18 inches of soil out so you can get the tractors in there, so you can get the crew in there. I also might leave more buds. So some of those suckers that we talked about earlier, I might leave some of those to devigorate the vines, especially in our really fertile soils where I know we're going to have to hedge 2-3 times if I don't do this. And that basically balance out. You leave more shoots. The water, the resources that vine has get spread out across more shoots. So we might leave more buds. If we're pruning and we're already seeing we're above average rainfall in January, February, and we're knowing it's going to be a wet year, then I will leave more buds out there to help balance out the vine. The vine's going to have much more resources at its disposal. It's going to have much more water. That compost is going to break down more effectively. The cover crop is going to break down more effectively. The manures from the sheep are going to break down more effectively. It's going to have tons of nutrients, tons of water. And if you leave a few buds and a few shoots and a few clusters out there, they're going to be way overly vigorous. The vines are going to have way too much energy.
You can always take it off later. You can never put it back on.
Always take it off later. Yeah, you can never put it back on. So typically I'll start with more buds. If I don't know which way the vintage is going to go, I'm going to start with more buds because, like you said, I can always take fruit off. I can always take shoots off later in the season as the season starts to develop and we know what we've got.
Once that crystal ball becomes crystal clear.
Yes, exactly. It starts out a little foggy and then it clears up as the vintage goes on. But you can always take stuff off the vine. You can't put it back on. So in a wet year, you leave a little bit extra because you need that vine to balance itself. And then in a dry year, you want to leave less so it can put all that energy and all its resources into those fewer buds to make sure it's balanced.
Okay, so we've got that. We've got some tools that we have for cool vintages. What are the key differences between when you know it's going to be warm? Like, let's talk about vintages like 2020, like 2022. Even part of 2021. 2021 was pretty warm. It was warm in January. It was warm all the way through. We had some really big heat spikes in June, right? June and July, which again, we talked about those critical times. In your vacuum, we hit those critical
we had
periods.
some July heat waves.
Which is rough. So what are the key differences?
Even last year, we had, in 24, we had a few July.
We did.
Not as bad, but yeah.
I mean, we also kind of saw it coming. We have those tools at our disposal and said, okay, hold, just stop everything. Let's get through this heat wave and see where we come out the other side. Don't leave, turn on the water. Let's make sure everything's happy and healthy. We came through it relatively unscathed, which again, collaboration is king there. But let's talk about the key differences between cool and warm, right? So in a warm vintage, what would you do differently than in cool?
So typically a warm vintage goes hand in hand with a dry vintage. That's not always the case, but typically it's a dry vintage, which means you typically have less canopy to protect the fruit. You don't have, shoots that are growing up the top wire and dangling back over because they're so vigorous. In a warm vintage, the cover crop's going to take up more of that water. And so first thing we're going to do is we're going to disc. We're going to hold that watering. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to shoot them more aggressively. We're going to remove more shoots in a dry, hot vintage to make sure the ones that are left are really strong and can support the fruit that we leave out there and can ripen it and develop flavors. The leaves are where all the precursors are made that go into the fruit. So we want to make sure there's a proper balance between the amount of fruit we leave out there and the amount of leaves that are left out there. And second is we want to protect the fruit, right? We want to keep that fruit shaded. Direct sunlight, when it's over 100 degrees, is a nightmare for Pinot Noir. It will sunburn so quickly and raisin up, and it'll just dry out. And we've seen it before. It happens, to a certain extent, almost every year. You at least find a few clusters where that happens that are really exposed. Southwest, they're sticking out of the canopy southwest.
Yeah, they get full sun all 16 hours of the day.
And so the number one thing we want to do is leave as many leaves and keep those leaves happy. So that might mean supplementing with extra irrigation. Irrigation is not something I love to do. I love to rely as much as possible on the natural rainfall, but it becomes necessary in dry years and hot years, especially when you see a heat wave coming. You want to irrigate before that heat wave so the vines can really start to take up that water and have excess water in their tissues before the heat wave comes. You want to really prepare the vineyard for that. You want to make sure you don't have weeds. You want to make sure that the vines have no competition out there. You want to make sure that they're happy and healthy going into that heat wave so they can fight it as best they can. The first thing to go when vines get stressed are what are called the basal leaves. The first 4 or so leaves as the shoot comes off the trunk or the cane that you leave out. It's those first 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves. Coincidentally, that's also where the fruit is. Those first 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually you have clusters on that second leaf, across from that second leaf, and across from that fourth leaf. So when you lose those first 4 leaves when the vine becomes stressed, you basically have fruit that's sitting out there naked. It's naked and it's in the sun and it's got no sunscreen on. It's a recipe for disaster. And so we want to keep those leaves on the vine. We want to make sure they're happy and healthy. Now, there's a lot of stuff we talked about redevelopment in past master classes. We can set up our vineyards. Row orientation is really important, making sure that you don't capture that late afternoon sunlight or the vines are evenly getting exposed on both sides. Typically, I don't pull leaves unless there's a disease pressure. We talk about cool years being cool, wet years, there being a lot of disease pressure, powdery mildew being the number one problem that we deal with, powdery mildew in Chardonnay being a sensitive variety. That's pretty much the only situation where I'll pull leaves is to strategically get sunlight on the fruit to help prevent or eradicate powdery mildew. The UV light will actually kill powdery mildew and prevent it from spreading. And so that, along with sprays, you have to pull the leaves to get better coverage and get your sulfur sprays on there. So that's really the only reason, and I'll only pull leaves on the side of the vine that sees morning sun.
Soft sun.
We call it soft sun. It's the morning sun where, it might get direct sunlight from like 6 a.m. to maybe 10 a.m. You're not getting sunburn at 6 a.m. or 10 a.m. But on the afternoon side where you're getting, maybe it's directly above the vine and then, between 4 and 7:30 p.m., you will definitely expose yourself to sunburn.
That direct, harsh, late afternoon
where it's been baking all day and then it gets the direct sunlight. That's the challenge. So making sure we keep that side of the vine really covered and only open it up for disease-related pressure where really the crop is at risk for it. But occasionally you do get burned. And so it's all about being resilient and going in and having the ability to send the crew out and drop the fruit that's sunburnt so it doesn't affect the wines. Making sure that, sometimes it can be up to 30% of the fruit that gets dropped on the ground because it's sunburnt, but that's something we have to do to preserve the quality of the wines. A lot of these wines are vintage wines. So you only get one shot at it. You can't blend it away. But yeah, that's kind of the big differences is, the reliance on irrigation and how many shoots that you leave, and then irrigation, it can make a huge difference. So
it can kind of give you a fail safe, right? In vintages where you have it. And that kind of transitions exactly what we do in the winemaking side. And it's why we work so closely together, right? Is these are things that, I'm already starting to think about vintage 2025. based on what we've done in 24, based on what we've done in 23. When we're working with vintage dated wines, it's very important that we are, one, capturing the house style. What is Gloria Ferrer's house style, right? Purity of fruit, sense of place, focus, intentionality, right? And when we have these things, you don't get a vintage that's the same every year. Making a style of wine that has the same threads in 2022 versus 2023 are two completely different skill sets.
So let me flip the question on its head and ask you, because the wines and the juice, essentially it starts with juice, right? Those juices that you get and those grapes that you get, you know, once they're delivered to the winery in a warm year and a cold year are going to be different. You're going to have differences in acidity. You're going to have differences in flavor profiles, all of that stuff. How do you handle that in the cellar?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because I think it has to start with what you're tasting in the vineyard, right? And the number one thing that I will say is give yourself time. Make a memory, an olfactory memory. It's why we go out daily when we're tasting these blocks that are getting close, so that we can understand the flavor development and the flavor potential of these specific blocks. Where in a vintage that's warm and you start to drop acidity really quickly, you need to not panic, but be much more on the ball, right? For instance, 2024 vintage we had ample rainfall, above average rainfall. I wouldn't say that it was a hot or cold vintage. It was kind of very...
It had cold stretches and it had warm stretches, but...
Median temperature was pretty average. Very little adverse heat effects. We had maybe one over the 4th of July weekend.
Yeah,
and that
we
was
had a little heat wave over the 4th of July weekend, but not a severe heat wave.
Severe heat wave. Late October got hot, but we were off the vine way ahead of that. So, you know, but it was a vintage that happened very quickly. So you needed to make sure that, you know, once you decided to pick, that was the call. And that's the thing is, number one, trust your gut. Watch the acids. Focus on acidity first. Because just as you can't put more fruit on the vine, we can't really put acid that feels correct back into a wine. We do have the ability. There are synthetic, you know, tartaric acid, malic acid, citric acid that are naturally occurring in grapes that you can put in. But for us, it's really about doing the least amount possible and relying on everything that comes naturally in the grape. And if you can pick it at the right time, you don't have to put these fixes in the cellar. So making sure that you understand the vintage, that you're looking at the weather. Just as you're looking at the weather, I mean, you and I sit down in the mornings and we're looking at 10, 15, 14 days out, right? And going, okay, we got to start making a plan. So focusing on acidity, because once that pH starts to climb with sparkling, it's very, very hard to get it back down. And pH is the driving factor for being able to make wines that stay fresh. You know, when we're talking about wines that's 2010 and 2015, so, you know, 15 and 10 years respectively, you have to have the pH at a low enough level that will preserve the freshness of that wine. And that comes from picking when the grapes are right. It's the best part that we have here is having a crew that can get out and mobilize and say, we got to pick today, right? Just as we did last year, right? We have to pick block F2 has to come out today. And, you know, you go out and have a meeting with the crew in the afternoon, we're picking the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. So having the ability to pick and focus on acids, that's kind of the key for me. Once acids start to fall, it's that you have kind of a 3 to 4 day window, right? Where don't panic pick, because that's the worst thing you can do. If you take grapes off the vine too soon, it's much harder to deal with than if you let them go just a little too far. It's much easier to apply the fixes if you have some ripe fruit character and you have some substance and weight to the wine. Whereas if you pick a wine that is nothing but acid and you can kind of taste the progression in the grapes, right? When you're tasting and you're going too tart, too tart, too tart, just right. You want to get it on that just right, but it's better to have it.
Yeah, when we're out there tasting the grapes, you don't need to be a professional to go out there and taste them and know when it's too early. You know,
that's exactly it.
The grapes, you could take anyone who's never made a wine in their life, never grown grapes in their life. You could give them some of these grapes, and they'll go, "It's too early to pick."
And we do that on these tours, right? Some of these behind the scenes tours where we go out,
they put the grapes in their mouth,
and they're like, "Oh!" It's that face where you're kind of like, "Oh."
And they know. And then the problem is then it can go too far where you lose the acidity, the sugars come up, the ripe flavors come up. The more still wine style. And that's essentially what still wine is. We pick it later, you know. Typically it's like 3-ish weeks later. Yeah,
and I think that the other thing that's a tool in our belt and that I think comes from making wines over a longer period of time is looking at the vintage as a whole, not just as a specific block and saying, I need to pick this block in a vacuum. Just as you don't farm in a vacuum, we're not making wine in a vacuum.
And don't look at the vintage as hey, it's the last 3 weeks. I only
Exactly.
remember the last 3 weeks of the vintage. I don't remember what happened in June or May.
Exactly.
You know?
So it's about understanding, and we did it this year as well with 2024. Get a little bit of a running start. It was one of those vintages that we both thought was going to kind of take off, and then we were going to go.
Took off,
right?
yeah.
We knew we were blessed in 2023. We could pick
that
when we
cold
wanted to
harvest
pick.
weather. It was like
We could pull
wait
3
around.
tons. We could pull 4 tons.
Yeah.
Maybe we take a day
a day
off.
Yeah, I got more days off in 2023 harvest than I've ever gotten in harvest.
Exactly. That did not happen in 24.
No.
We started on Friday. We took the first weekend off and picked every day except Sunday for them.
Yeah.
And so it's looking at the vintage as a whole and saying, what do I have at my disposal? Is this a warmer than average vintage? Do I need to have some blocks that are underripe? Is it a colder than average vintage where I need to let things get past their optimal ripeness because I don't know if the other blocks are going to get ripe? So it's looking at the total amount of wines that you need to make, the style of wine that you're trying to make, and then making it all fall together. It's like a game of Tetris, right?
Yeah.
You can't just constantly put pieces in one row and expect that whole board is going to fill up. You need to make sure that you're looking at this strategically and saying, I know what we have out there. We've been out there. We've been watching this progress. Where can we pull strategically? And so, you've done this with us sometimes where we'll pull blocks twice. Maybe we split pick. Maybe we go halfway down or halfway in. And we look at different vigor and we look at what's going on and say, and when you walk through, you know it. You walk through and you taste and you're like, those 6 rows taste great. And somehow you get across that little hill, that little mound, and it's just completely different. So I would say, making sure you trust your gut. Don't panic, right? The worst thing you can do is panic. Give yourself time to make the decision and look at things as a big, broad spectrum. And then once you get it into the winery, start evaluating. That's where you split hairs. Once you put, those blocks in, you've decided to pick, that's when you're saying, okay, I'm going to listen to this wine and figure out which way it wants to go. Do we have really intense aromatics? Lean into it. Do we have great weight? Let's go down that rabbit hole, right? So looking at things in a scope of how do you make a whole.
And that's the beauty of having vintage sparkling wines is that this 2015 and this 2010 from 2 very different vintage. You have a cool wet vintage and you have a warm dry vintage. These wines couldn't be more different. They're both Blanc de Blanc, made from essentially the same vineyards.
Yep.
And they couldn't be more different. And I mean, if I were to blind taste these, I would have guessed the 2015 was the older wine, which is very interesting because it's got more of that oxidized character.
Yep.
I'm going to guess it has a little bit less acid because it's a warmer vintage, more of that acid metabolized off.
Your alcohol's a little higher.
A little bit higher versus that 2010 Blanc de Blanc, which I'm going to assume the acid level's higher, the pH is lower, alcohol's lower. It's a little tighter.
Yep.
It's significantly different. But this is, they're 5 years apart, and the 5-year younger wine is actually the one that tastes like it has more aged, more yeasty character to it.
Yep.
So,
and that's where the thing that we've kind of discussed, and you and I have discussed this a lot lately, is the idea of creating, a true reserve wine program. And the reason for doing that is, as we talked earlier, the vintages in California, the highs are getting higher, the lows are getting lower. It's coming at a more rapid pace. The peaks and valleys are getting the delta between the two is getting much more. So
it's becoming very unpredictable. There's no, other than 2024, when was the last time we had a year that we could even remotely call an average year?
Yeah, that's the weird part is average has become abnormal.
Average has become the average between extremes, right?
So, but if what you do is you have a reserve wine program that's done with intentionality where we take a percentage of the wines every single year and we keep them. And you take a percentage out every year to, again, just smooth in strategic places, smooth those peaks and valleys. Draw that average back closer to average.
And this is a traditional technique from Champagne.
This is what they do in Champagne, because when we're talking about Champagne, it's like you have a vintage, you have 5 years with no vintage wines.
Yeah.
You have 3 vintages in a row, you have 10 years with no vintages, right? Or maybe you only made 1 wine in these 5 years.
Yeah.
So it's where their extremes are far more than us. It's something that we can learn from and say, it's a way for us to create a style that's much more consistent, that doesn't rely on, other techniques of manipulation and things like that, but just creatively blending in a way that makes the wines feel cohesive, where maybe in a warmer year, you didn't have as much acid. So we take some of the reserve wines that were from a cooler year and we put a little bit in, and we then take a little bit out. So you can do these things like give yourself a little bit of space, give yourself a little bit of grace.
And create consistency.
And create consistency across a long period of time.
Consistency and quality.
Correct, across a longer period of time. To create consistency within a single vintage, you can definitely do that, because you can say this is what the vintage gave us.
But
these wines are all consistent.
On blending, you have to lean a lot more on aging, things like that.
Exactly. You can make 20 different wines that are all very similar within a vintage, but they will be very different than the next vintage. So to create consistency across a length of time is the point of creating this reserve wine program, which is something that, we're going to start doing, where we're looking at things and saying, we know we need some complexity. We know we need some intrigue. We know we need to create a fail-safe if these really extreme vintages happen again. So another thing it does is it also just gives you blending components, right? If there was a year like 2024 where it was, again, average, and we're very thankful for that, to give yourself an extra component. I don't think any winemaker is ever going to say, I wish I had less to work with.
Yeah,
right?
Less tools in my tool belt.
Exactly. If I have, you're always going to be thankful to have that tool, and maybe you don't need it, maybe you don't use it. But what it does is it gives you those options. Just like you leave more shoots, it gives us the option to I don't have to put it in, but in the event that
you can make a deposit in your wine bank, and
you can hold it there,
save it for a rainy day.
And that's the best part about sparkling, is you can create that through these programs that we do that are a little bit different than making still wine and stuff like that. So it just gives us a stylistic component to work with, to showcase the house style in vintages where it's very hard to do that. It's fun to get into these older wines though, where we're talking about 2010, talking about 2015, the 2010 cool year, right? Very cold in the
2010 might be my favorite, man. It is something else.
It's hitting right now. And then, so you're talking a wine where you had very favorable pH, you had very favorable acids, because 2010 was a very cool, even growing year. A lot of rain and rainfall in 2009 to the early part of 2010. The only market factor was it was cold all the way through the summer. So there was a lot of people that leafed early. That doesn't look like the case here, where sunburn was a problem. That was 2010 was
that signature stringency.
That
bitterness that you get from wines that have had dealt with sunburn. That's not at all in here. I think those cool years, and I also think the benefit of sparkling wine is we pick early. So a lot of times these hazards, whether it's wildfires, which have been a huge problem in wine country in recent years, whether it's these heat waves, a lot of times they come after we're already picked out. The vines still have to sit through them, but you don't have to.
You're not worried about
You don't ruin the vintage. It doesn't ruin the vintage. You look at a vintage like 2022, when we had heat waves Labor Day weekend, all of the sparkling wine was in the winery fermenting already.
It was almost done fermenting.
It was almost done. So it was, for us, yes, it was a warmer than average vintage, but we didn't deal with the amount of catastrophic heat waves where it was 110 degrees for 5 days that a lot of other producers did. 2022 was a very difficult vintage for a lot of people.
Sure.
And, of course, we still had some still wine out, but for sparkling wine, it was a nice
very nice vintage.
And the wines are showing extremely well. And so for us, it's, we're able to kind of duck out as the things are getting bad, we kind of step back and we're done.
Ace in our pocket, right? Whereas
we get to make all the other growers and winemakers jealous because we're all done. We're packing it up, ready to go on vacation, and they're all just getting started. So
but fun to taste these old wines side by side, and I think that's a perfect time to start taking some questions.
Well, let me ask you one thing, Kyle.
Great.
What was your favorite vintage that you've ever made wine in?
Ooh, that is a great.
And why?
That's a really really nice question. 2016 is one that just always is going to be near and dear to my heart. It is a vintage. 2016 was such a nice vintage. You 15 was small, right? 15 was marked by like very small crop, concentrated berries. I mean, these berries look like little ball bearings. They were tiny,
berries,
so you had immense, and you can taste it in this 15 that we're tasting. The weight is exceptional, very good concentration. But 16, there was no real adverse effects. We had plenty of rainfall. Tannin structure though in 16. I have not found a wine that I've made since then that had such seamless, soft, integrated tannins as 2016. And I think the difference was we had a pretty long growing season. Like bud break happened earlier, but then we had really slow, even ripening throughout the years or throughout the months. And what it did was just give you the chance to get an ample amount of tannin, but it was all ripe. And that's the best thing you want as a winemaker, is making wines that are seamless all the way through. And that's really the for me, the signature of 2016 was wines that were just cohesive from start to finish. Did not need to apply a lot of techniques in the winery, didn't have to do as many adjustments in the vineyard, just wines that had a lot of character because of the length of the growing season as well. So what about you? I know I just stole your vintage.
Yeah,
but,
2016 was a fun vintage. It was one that I remember being fairly easy vintage, which you don't say that very often in California. But I'm going to have to say, other than 2016, I'm going to have to say maybe 2018. 2018 was another vintage, not quite as extreme as 2023, but it started off very cool, very wet. It kind of broke a little bit of a drought. It was a vintage where things started slow. It really was long and late. Stuff came in much later than it typically would. It was a big crop. Big crop. Historically, famously large crop. So opposite of your pick.
Which was great.
It was great because we had so many years of low crops. Having that bumper crop really helped a lot of growers and farmers. And then also the quality was excellent. You had the rain, so you had the canopy, you had the leaves. We talked about having the balance between fruit and leaves. So you had the rain and you had the canopy to be able to ripen that amount of fruit. And yes, it was slow. I remember picking grapes into November that year, and I wasn't at Gloria, but I was growing a lot of Chardonnay, and I just remember Chardonnay not coming in until November.
I picked Chardonnay in November that year too, and
it was a long harvest, but I think the quality was excellent. Mildew was a problem, as it is in cool, wet years, but it's something that we know how to deal with, and we do deal with. But I really have fond memories of that harvest, and I really enjoyed the wines are kind of coming because it was a cooler year. Sometimes those cold years, the wines take a little bit longer to come into their own. And I've just had a few 2018s recently, and it's like brought me right back to that vintage, being in the vineyard and being, remembering what a fun vintage it was.
I have to say it was such a nice vintage because you could pick whenever you wanted, which is a winemaker's dream and a vineyard manager's nightmare, right?
Yeah.
It's like, we're sitting as winemakers, we're sitting there like, it can hang for a while. Let's just let it go.
Let it develop.
But yeah, we do have a question here. Does the weather affect how long you ferment wines? It's a really good question. It can, absolutely. And the reason is not in a direct manner. The reason weather can affect how long you ferment wines is if you have some sort of damage or you have some sort of contamination. As the years get hotter and hotter, when you have grapes that have, let's say, some bee damage or some bird damage on there, and that opens up the space for microbes that you don't really want coming into the winery, spoilage organisms coming in.
Hail can be an issue.
Hail can be a big issue. So anytime you get damage on this fruit,
knock on wood, we typically don't get hail. But
let's pray that's one thing we don't have to deal with.
Yeah, that's one thing we don't have to, but it can, globally it can be a problem.
Yeah, and so when you get damaged fruit, or you have fruit that cannot get ripe enough, you can adjust your fermentation time. Not ripe enough being fermentation time being too short, and sometimes your pH is too low that it really causes a problem, and you can have what's called a stuck fermentation, meaning the yeast stop fermenting. Same thing with damage. If you have spoilage organisms, you can get a stuck fermentation, or just a very sluggish, what we call sluggish. That's probably one of the worst things that we can have happen, is to get a sluggish fermentation, because As you have an oxidative environment when you have a fermentation, if the yeast haven't taken over and outpopulated all of the other organisms, the other organisms can then start to fight against the yeast,
Yeah, you can
slow
have
the
problems
fermentation
like
down.
Brett, you can have problems
Yes.
with VA.
VA, Brettanomyces. Luckily, we don't deal with that really at sparkling pHs, but you can just have wines that have off characters. So it's important to assess the fruit when it comes in, so that and what we will do is if we see that damaged fruit, I'll pull out the sorting table. And we will actually go slower. I'll ask to pick less because we know we can process less per day. And we'll actually pull out all of the stuff that we don't want or things that have...
That's ugly looking.
Yep.
If you wouldn't put it in your mouth, don't
put it in the fermenter. Yeah.
I'm going to piggyback off of your answer as well and say unrelated to vineyard conditions, also weather traditionally can affect the length of fermentations because of the temperature of the ambient temperature of your cellar or of wherever you're fermenting your wines. It can really affect how fast and the dynamics of that fermentation. So the warmer yeast are, the more energy they are, the more energized they are, the more they're multiplying, the more they're consuming sugar quickly. And the colder it is, they start to move in slow motion, right?
Yep.
They're creating alcohol very slowly. They're eating sugars more slowly. And so they're consuming that sugar at a lower rate in a colder climate. And that's how champagne was even invented. We talked about method ancestral, and they put the wines away and they bottled them because they thought they were done fermenting because it got cold, and then it warmed back up in the spring and they started fermenting in the bottle, and that's how you have sparkling wine. So there's a couple ways that weather can, but that's and today in a modern winery, less of an issue. We have temperature control.
But in something like barrel fermentation, it's absolutely
still can affect it.
And we'll do things like when we barrel ferment our Chardonnay, I'll ask the cellar crew to rotate from front to back and top to bottom. Because even within a stack of 4 barrels, the barrels at the top are much warmer than the barrels at the bottom.
Yeah, all the heat from those other barrels are rising up.
Exactly. Well, and you have heat above
and generally
you as well.
Heat in the cave or in the cellar.
It's interesting because you can have as much as like a 15% difference in fermentation, sometimes even larger, from top to bottom and front to back. So
it could even be if it's cold in the cellar and there's a sluggish fermentation and it's warm outside, move it outside, put it into the sun, let it warm up there, and sometimes it'll kickstart those sluggish fermentations.
Weather can be as much your friend as it can be your foe. So, well, that is a perfect place for us to say thank you for joining us tonight to our masterclass, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks for the conclusion of our series, and we're going to be talking about still wine.
Come get yourself some of this 2010 Blanc de Blanc.
Definitely. This one is on fire.
I'll be drinking the rest of this bottle tonight.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.